Have you ever wanted to get yourself a Nintendo 64 but don't know where to start? Then this video is for you. We're going to take a look at the console, that controller, games, as well as other odds and ends. By the end of this video, you should have a good idea of what the N64 is about. And if you already know the information, hopefully you'll still have a good time hanging out and watching a video about a great system. And just so you know, this video is from a North American perspective, but PAL regions shouldn't be all that different. The first conscious memories I have of new console releases was during the 90s with the 5th generation of video game consoles. This was the era when video games transitioned to 3D gameplay. It was a new thing, and something that makes this generation interesting to me is all the different approaches developers had when it came to three-dimensional gameplay. We now know that Sony's approach won out in the end. Optical media, memory cards, which later became hard drives, and this exact controller layout ended up becoming the standard for almost all later home consoles. This is actually one of the reasons the N64 is such an interesting thing. Nintendo approached the system in a different way. Depending where you live, the N64 came out either in 96 or 97. There's still a cartridge, which doesn't hold as much data as a CD, but it does mean really quick loading times at least. The layout of the N64 is just like the Super Nintendo. On and off switch on the left, reset on the right. Game goes on top. Controllers go on the front, except there's 4 ports now. Even the controller shares a lot of its basic design with a Super Nintendo controller, believe it or not. D-pad, that's right here. Face buttons, right here, but they do look a little different and there's a few new ones. L and R still present, but it's the middle where things are really different. Analog stick and a Z button on the back. When it comes to actually buying a system, I recommend looking for something that's as complete as possible. That's usually cheaper than having to buy each individual item separately. Obviously, you're going to need the system itself, at least one controller, though 2 or 3 might be better, a C adapter, and a V cable. There's also a couple of accessories I recommend that I'll mention in a bit. In terms of the system itself, most people will be fine with whatever N64 system they can find. There's a few interesting colors and special editions available, which of course will set you back a bit more money than the regular gray ones. I do like the look of the various transparent ones, and there's even the famous Pikachu edition, which is almost offensively asymmetrical. Despite the fact that there was never a redesign for the N64, there are various motherboard revisions. RetroRGB.com is a really good source for more information on that. Not just the N64, but many other retro consoles. Not only is it possible to RGB mod the N64, but even HDMI is a thing. It's worth looking at, especially if you want to hook it up to a modern TV. I will say now that the image quality is pretty tragic on something that isn't a CRT. Even a CRT, I don't like the image quality. I also recommend a bit of cleaning. I mean, these things are basically almost 20 years old and over 20 years old in some cases. Some sort of credit card wrapped in a thin microfiber cloth, lightly saturated in rubbing alcohol is a good way to clean out the slot. Grunge can build up on the gooch, so I also recommend using one of these game bits to open the thing up and give everything a once-over. It's really easy to do, and these bits are pretty cheap to buy. They also allow you to open up cartridges and other Nintendo consoles. There's a link in the description if you want a set. The controller is something you have to pay attention to because of the analog stick. This one isn't too bad, but you can see how it flops around. Some are worse than this, which can make playing games impossible because you keep moving around despite not even touching the stick. The reason for that is that the mechanism contains a lot of plastic parts that are just rubbing against each other. I've swapped some sticks around, and if you open up the joystick itself, a lot of times you're going to find white powder in there. There's just too much friction going on. I actually really like the N64 controller. It's just the stick that's letting it down. Even when brand new, I remember not liking the feel of them. I'm a big fan of using original equipment whenever possible, but you can look at alternative options for controllers since actual Nintendo controllers for the N64 are getting harder to get. Good ones, I mean. I see reproduction controllers floating around, but I have no idea what they're like because I don't have much experience with third-party controllers. Some research online reveals that the analog sticks can be a bit too sensitive on them, which can be problematic in some games. I would recommend another option, which is swapping out the joystick with a third-party replacement. Again, the same kind of problem can persist, but it's super easy to do, and there's a few different styles available. Some are more like the originals, while others are inspired by the GameCube, and some might even prefer that. All you have to do is just remove the screws, and then you can take the controller apart, disconnect the little cable from the joystick, swap the joysticks out, plug it back in, screw it back together. If it's not the analog stick, but the controller's shape that hurts your feelings, There are some differently shaped alternatives too. This one from Hori might be a bit small for some, but many seem to like it as well. Another option is this one from Retro Fighters. Regular sized, and the shape is much more contemporary. Another option, which doesn't exist yet, are the Steel Sticks 64 reproductions. They aim to retain the OEM style mechanism, just in metal. It looks like it's going to be awesome, so if you're serious about gaming on the N64, keep this on your radar. Let's talk about some accessories you might want to look at. One of the most important ones, in my opinion, is the expansion pack. The expansion pack just plugs into the top of the system and doubles the RAM of the system. Only a couple of games actually require it, but one of them is Majora's Mask, so that's already one good reason to have it. The expansion pack also enables extra features or graphical enhancements to a number of games, so if Zelda wasn't enough, maybe this is. If you do get a system that doesn't come with one, make sure it has the jumper pack instead. That's what systems came with when they were new, and you need one for the N64 to work if you don't have an expansion pack. The controller pack is another one you might want to take a look at. It's actually just a memory card despite the name. I guess it was called that because it plugs into the bottom of the controller. Not all games need it, but I think it's best to have it, that way you don't have any problems running certain games. You may also consider the Rumble pack. It's pretty big, requires batteries, but it was an innovative feature at the time. People used to think that force feedback was gimmicky, but that became the standard very quick. And what about games? Since this is a Nintendo system, I'm sure many people want to play Nintendo games. That makes sense to me. Another reason why it's worth playing those games is because many of them are so important in terms of being historical milestones in the world of video games. The big ones have to be Mario and Zelda. It's difficult for franchises to transition from 2D to 3D, but somehow Nintendo managed very well. In fact, many people consider Super Mario 64 as well as Ocarina of Time, and by extension Majora's Mask, as some of the best games in their entire franchises. Very high praise indeed. Other games you undoubtedly heard of before are GoldenEye, Pokemon Stadium, and Pokemon Snap. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie were games I thought were very cool as well. I remember playing Banjo-Kazooie on one of those kiosks, and I liked it more than Mario 64. The N64 also included a lot of firsts for the Mario franchise. It had the first Paper Mario, Smash Brothers, Mario Party, and Mario Tennis games, as long as you don't count the Virtual Boy game Mario's Tennis. Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Snap were a big deal too, because that was the first time we got to see Pokemon in 3D. Star Fox was really pushing what the Super Nintendo could do, and you can tell the hardware limitation held it back. The N64 game looks amazing in comparison. It's worth checking out a couple of best N64 or hidden gems lists. There's quite a few notable N64 games that aren't Nintendo games that you can find that way. Other than the already mentioned Banjo-Kazooie, I enjoyed Star Wars Rogue Squadron and that Star Wars racing game I can't remember the name of right now. Shadow Man I thought was pretty good, though I played that on PC. Turok. And despite not getting such great reviews, I liked Nightmare Creatures. I thought that was a pretty creepy game when I was a kid. There's a lot to discover here. Here's a thought I had recently. A lot of times sports games get ignored by most retro gamers, but I think it might be worth picking up a few, even if you don't like them. Because they're super cheap and also a lot of times cross-platform titles, they serve as a good way to highlight various differences between systems of the same generation. Sometimes it's a totally different experience. It's worth considering, I think, just for the sake of being able to compare. There's other interesting Nintendo 64 things worth talking about. The Transfer Pack is another add-on that allows data to be transferred between Game Boy or Game Boy Color games and N64 games. Pokemon Stadium famously allows the transfer of Pokemon. Japan got a device called the 64DD, which utilizes the bottom expansion port. There seems to be a tradition with Nintendo and these pedestal-style accessories. There's the Famicom Disk System, the Satellaview add-on for the Super Famicom, the 64DD, the Game Boy Player for the GameCube, and that's it. Afterwards, they thought, well, I guess we better stop doing that now. The 64DD was a disk drive unit like the Famicom disk drive, but it also included online connectivity that is slightly reminiscent to the Satellaview add-on. I talked about the Satellaview, by the way, in the Zelda spin-offs video, if you want some more information on that. I know it may be difficult, but don't let the thumbnail of Tingle put you off. In the end, the 64DD was not a very popular accessory and ended up being a commercial failure. It's interesting that a bunch of the most known N64 games were supposed to be 64DD games. Some examples are Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Donkey Kong 64, Paper Mario, Pokemon Snap, and Pokemon Stadium. Other games ended up being released later on other platforms, like Resident Evil, which landed on the GameCube, and also the infamous Dreamcast game Seaman. Developers must have put a lot of trust into the 64DD when it was first announced, because there's a notable list of games that were supposed to be released on it. And that's the Nintendo 64. Hopefully you got something out of the video, whether it's information or just general entertainment. The N64 definitely represents an era where things were going through a lot of change, which is what makes the system such an interesting console to experience. I also want to say thank you to all the new recent Patreon supporters. Your support is really helping out the channel a lot. In fact, I'm looking at putting that money to use and getting new systems or other hardware I can show you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.